Imagine yourself standing in the gilded halls of Versailles, where towering mirrors reflect not only the shimmer of candlelight, but also the hidden battles for power that history rarely reveals. In a world where noble blood dictated fate, where those born into luxury believed thrones, titles, and even the king's heart were their birthright, one woman emerged from ordinary origins to shatter all those rules. The question is, how could a commoner rise to become not just the official mistress of Louis XV, but also his trusted political advisor, almost a shadow queen in the most dazzling court of Europe? The story of Madame de Pompadour is one of paradox, romantic yet ruthless, glittering yet tragic. She was not born into power, had no crown waiting for her, only a vague prophecy and a burning desire to carve her name into history. With intellect, charm, and an unshakable will, she journeyed from the literary salons of Paris to the king's heart, claiming a place that the nobility despised but could never dislodge. Yet Pompadour was never content to remain just a royal mistress. When beauty and health began to fade, when love alone could no longer secure her power, she reinvented herself as an advisor, a political companion, a master of subtle influence behind the throne. She shaped France's foreign policy, intervened in the arts and culture, and transformed Versailles into the very emblem of Rococo splendor. And in the end, she stood as living proof of a cruel irony. In Versailles, where everything seemed eternal, power did not rest solely in the hands of kings. It could belong to a woman who knew how to make a king's heart utterly dependent on her. This is not just a story of love or ambition. It is the tragedy of a woman who both wielded and was ultimately crushed by the relentless machinery of Bourbon power. On December 29, 1721, in a Paris still suffocated by smoke, dust, and the unrest of the Bourbon court, a baby girl was born with the unassuming name Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson. At first glance, the surname Poisson sounded hopelessly ordinary, tied to merchants and the middling ranks of society, people who could never dream of touching the gilded walls of Versailles. But Jeanne's destiny was never meant to be that of a modest bourgeois woman, content with a husband, children, and an anonymous life fading into nothing. Her father, François Poisson, supplied provisions for the army. He was clever, ambitious, but soon caught in the jaws of a massive financial scandal. Accused of embezzlement and fraud at a time when Paris was suffering from food shortages, he faced the death penalty if captured. To save himself, François fled the country, leaving his wife and young daughter behind. It was Jeanne's first wound, a scar carved into childhood, and an early lesson in how fragile power could be when it lacked solid foundations. Her mother, Louise Madeleine de la Motte, was forced out of comfort and into austerity, raising her daughter with little more than determination and will. But rather than surrender to despair, she instilled in Jeanne a relentless hunger to rise above her station. By her example, Louise Madeleine became the first proof in her daughter's eyes that a woman, too, could wrestle fate with courage and resolve. It was then that another figure entered Jeanne's story. Charles Lenormant de Tourneham, a wealthy man without children who became her protector. Rumors whispered that he might have been more than a benefactor, that he might have been her true father, but the truth was never confirmed. What mattered was this: he invested in Jane's future. He gave her an education worthy of the nobility, opening doors no middle-class girl could have imagined. And then came the moment of prophecy. When Jeanne was only 4 or 5, her mother took her to see Madame Laban, one of Paris's famed fortune-tellers. In the dim candlelight, as the woman peered into the little girl's hand or read the leaves at the bottom of a cup, she spoke words that would shape a destiny. Your daughter will capture the heart of a king. For many, it would have been a line tossed off to please a client. But for Louise Madeleine, it became a command. From that moment, her daughter was no longer simply Jeanne. She was Reynette, the little queen, raised not as a merchant's child, but as a girl destined to walk among monarchs. Instead of the usual upbringing of a tradesman's daughter, Jeanne was sent to a convent school, where most of the nuns were themselves from noble families. Within walls steeped in the legacy of St. Louis Mythe, she received an education unlike anything her peers outside could ever touch. She learned refinement in speech, the art of conversation, the grace of movement and manners. She sang, danced, played music. It was not just education. It was preparation. Preparation for a life extraordinary, for a destiny even Jeanne herself could not yet imagine, though her mother and guardian had already charted the path. Yet it was within this turbulent childhood, through whispers about her parentage, through the wounds of her father's disgrace, that Jeanne absorbed her most crucial lesson. In an unjust world, a woman had to be both soft and sharp, pliant and unyielding. And so, from the ashes of the name Poisson, Jeanne grew into Rainette, the little queen, nurtured by ambition and illusion alike, awaiting the day when prophecy would turn into reality. Jeanne-Antoinette's childhood had already taken a turn unlike most of her peers. While other children of her generation were busy learning a trade or preparing for a predictable arranged marriage, she was being trained as though destined to step into the spotlight of high society. Guided by her mother and her influential patron, Tourneham, Jeanne studied singing under renowned opera performers, learned elocution from stage actors, practiced music and dance, and above all, mastered the art of words, using them not simply to speak, but to enchant. Every gesture, every shrug of the shoulders, every carefully measured smile was polished until it became an art form. She was not merely a pretty girl. She radiated something far brighter, as though she had been marked from birth to shine in the crowd. By the time she turned 19, Jeanne had blossomed into a young woman whose beauty left onlookers entranced. But beauty was not her greatest asset. What set her apart was her confidence, her ability to make others feel seen, heard, and understood. Unlike women who relied solely on looks to secure a husband, Jeanne carried within her a magnetism of presence. Her first marriage, to Charles Guillaume Lenormand d'Etiaux, was less a romantic destiny than a stepping stone. Her husband was kind, wealthy, indulgent, but to Jeanne, the quiet role of a contented wife was never the final goal. At Etiaux, in their home, she began building something far more significant, her own stage. The literary and artistic salons she hosted quickly became gathering places for thinkers, poets, artists, and figures of influence. Within those walls, Jeanne was at once the gracious hostess, the star performer, and the conductor of conversation. People flocked to Etiaux not only to enjoy music or theater, but to witness her presence, to hear her reflections on philosophy, literature, and even politics. Her name was not yet Pompadour, but Rainette, the affectionate nickname, was already becoming a phenomenon. The plays in which she starred, the songs she performed, the spirited debates she orchestrated, all of these were rehearsals, honing her ability to captivate. Every glance, every turn of phrase, every deliberate movement became a weapon of charm. If Versailles was Europe's grandest stage, Etiaux was her rehearsal hall where she prepared for the greatest performance of her life. And indeed, it was not long before whispers of an intelligent, enchanting, and unconventional young woman reached beyond the walls of her private salons, carrying all the way to the ears of the king. Jeanne-Antoinette, once merely the daughter of a man named Poisson, had already traveled halfway along the path foretold by prophecy. And that path was only just beginning to open before her. In 1745, the moment Jeanne-Antoinette had been waiting for finally arrived. Louis XV, hailed at the time as the most handsome man in Europe, was 32 years old, still at the height of his charm, but wearied by the endless burdens of the throne. He sought relief in the hunts through the royal forests and the glittering masquerade balls of Versailles, and it was there that Jeanne stepped onto the stage of her destiny. People whispered that she would ride in a small carriage, dressed in her most eye-catching gowns, deliberately crossing the king's hunting path until one day Louis's gaze lingered on her longer than it ever had before. That February, during a masked ball, everything changed. In the shimmering hall of mirrors, surrounded by dazzling costumes and enigmatic masks, Jeanne-Antoinette appeared like a hidden goddess revealed among the crowd. When she was finally introduced to the king, every eye in the hall turned toward them. That entire evening, Louis XV barely left her side, and soon Versailles began to buzz with gossip about a woman who, until then, had been known only in the artistic salons of Etiaux. Jeanne did not win the king's heart with impulsiveness or blatant seduction, but through a delicate grace and the captivating art of conversation. While the nobles of Versailles busied themselves flaunting wealth and pedigree, she made Louis XV feel something he had long forgotten, listened to, understood, comforted. In a palace that usually felt like a cold theater of ritual and intrigue, Jeanne offered him a sense of home, a refuge for a king burdened with profound loneliness. That contrast made her irreplaceable in his eyes. But the king's love came at a cost. To the court, her very presence was an outrage. A woman named Poisson, with no noble blood, daring to take the official place of royal mistress, a role traditionally reserved for aristocrats, was an insult to every proud blue-blooded family of France. They mocked her, spread vicious rumors, penned cruel satirical verses. Yet, the more they tried to break her, the more Jeanne proved her wit, her resilience, her unshakable poise. From the very first days at the king's side, she understood that love alone would not secure her place at Versailles. What kept her there was her ability to make Louis XV feel safe. In a court where everyone schemed, deceived, and sought advantage, she chose instead to be his sanctuary. And so, the king's new mistress became more than a passing flame. She became the quiet heart of Versailles itself, the woman at the center of every gaze, whether filled with admiration or seething with hate. After that fateful night of celebration, Jeanne-Antoinette Poisson's rise at Versailles was so swift it seemed almost unreal. Just months later, Louis XV granted her a formal title, Marquise de Pompadour. With a single stroke, a woman born into the middle class was wrapped in the armor of nobility, given a rank that allowed her to stand tall in the glittering court. For the aristocracy who already despised her, it was a stunning blow. This act did more than confirm her place in the king's heart. It legitimized her presence as an essential part of palace life. When she stepped into Versailles, she didn't choose open confrontation. Instead, she wielded grace, intelligence, and something even more disarming, the ability to transform the cold, ceremonial chambers into spaces that felt warm, intimate, and profoundly human. She was the one who created the petit cabinet, a small, secret room of surprising power. It was a private salon where Louis XV could escape the suffocating rituals, leave behind the watchful eyes of the court, and simply talk, read, perform little plays, or listen to Pompadour sing. Versailles was a theater of endless ceremony, but the petit cabinet was the stage where the king's heart truly belonged to her. In that sanctuary, Pompadour became the center of gravity. She was not just a mistress, but a confidante, a source of joy, and little by little, an advisor in political decisions. By becoming his refuge, she reshaped the balance of power. Anyone who wished to reach the king first had to pass through her doors. From this private space, she transformed love into soft power, an authority unwritten in law, yet stronger than any royal decree. But her path was never easy. Frail by nature, often sick, she endured multiple pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or the loss of infants too young to survive. In a court that judged a woman's worth by her ability to bear children, these tragedies could have destroyed her. Yet instead of succumbing, she turned her sorrow into a weapon for survival. If she could not give Louis XV heirs, she gave him something else, a sense of being loved, understood, and sheltered from the cold machinery of politics and war. She knew his heart was fragile, prone to loneliness, and she devoted herself to being the one place of comfort he could trust. One of her greatest challenges was her relationship with Queen Maria Leszczyńska. In a world defined by rivalry, a king's mistress was expected to be the queen's bitterest enemy. But Pompadour took another path. She avoided provocation, never sought to humiliate, and instead displayed respect and even friendliness. At their first meeting, she skillfully steered the conversation toward a mutual acquaintance, showing deference and courtesy. A small gesture, but a calculated one. Rather than turning the queen into a foe, Pompadour created a fragile but vital harmony at court. Remarkably, Maria, long accustomed to her husband's silent betrayals, seemed almost at ease with this new mistress, even at times preferring Pompadour to the king's previous companions. That was Pompadour's unique brilliance. She understood that power at Versailles was not only about holding the king's heart, but about soothing everyone around him, from the queen to the courtiers. She avoided making outright enemies, instead weaving a web of soft, durable connections that kept her firmly at the center. Though her body remained frail and she never bore the king an heir, Pompadour was never dislodged from Versailles. This endurance was not due to love alone, but to the secret formula she had mastered, being the one person who could make Louis XIV feel that the throne was not a burden. In a world where everyone was replaceable, she achieved the impossible. She became indispensable. When the romance between Pompadour and Louis XV began to fade, many at Versailles believed her time was over. Her beauty was waning, her health fragile, and without the spark of passion to hold the king's attention, she seemed destined to retreat from the stage. Yet, in that very moment of decline, Pompadour revealed that she was far more than a royal mistress. She was a political force. No longer just a dazzling companion, she became Louis XV's only true confidante, a constant and intimate presence whose quiet influence weighed on nearly every decision of the crown. At Versailles, where every gaze was fixed on the king, his heart often remained adrift. Pompadour understood this better than anyone. She reinvented her role, shifting it from the bed to the table, where long candlelit conversations unfolded about politics, art, and diplomacy. She became the one Louis turned to when trust in others failed. Amid a court drowning in schemes and flatterers, Pompadour stood apart not because she lacked ambition, but because she knew how to align her ambitions with the king's needs. To Louis, she was both sanctuary and second mind. From a participant in leisure, she swiftly became a mediator in matters of state. Courtiers sought her recommendations, begged her to intercede with the king, and slipped her sealed letters. From appointments and promotions to which artists should receive patronage, from court intrigues to foreign policy, Pompadour's imprint was everywhere. She was so deft in her maneuvering that many whispered she was the true prime minister, with official ministers reduced to mere functionaries. This perception crystallized during the forging of the Franco-Austrian alliance. By the mid-18th century, Europe was caught in a new vortex of power, and Pompadour, through her close ties with Austrian diplomats, emerged as a pivotal figure in sealing the pact. The Austrians knew well, to persuade Louis XV, one first had to persuade Pompadour. And indeed, through her, the alliance was struck, drawing France into the 7 Years' War. But war became the shadow that stained her legacy. France suffered defeat, lost colonies, drained its treasury, and watched its prestige crumble. The nobility and the public alike blamed Pompadour, claiming that the meddling of a mistress had dragged the nation into ruin. They mocked her as Prime Minister Pompadour, sneering at her common origins and treating the disaster as proof that a woman of low birth should never meddle in affairs of state. Yet the truth was far more complex. The Franco-Austrian alliance was not simply her whim. It reflected the tectonic shifts of European politics. Pompadour was not the sole architect of failure, but one cog in a machine already teetering. Despite the storm of criticism, her influence at Versailles did not wane. She still determined who might approach the king, who gained favor, and who was cast aside. The meetings in the Petit Cabinet were no longer just diversions. They became councils of power, where the fates of men and the direction of France itself were decided in the intimacy of evening hours. What made her extraordinary was that Pompadour never held an official title. She was not a minister, not a magistrate, not even part of the court's formal hierarchy. And yet, through intellect, resilience, and an uncanny grasp of Louis XIV's psyche, she became France's shadow prime minister. She proved that true power does not always rest in offices or crowns, but in the ability to win absolute trust and dependence from a king. And it is in this paradox that Pompadour carved her indelible mark, a woman of humble birth who steered the politics of a nation, a mistress who became a confidante who became power itself, and a power that, though scorned, endures in the memory of Versailles as the emblem of a soft yet dangerous strength. If political power made Madame de Pompadour the hidden prime minister of France, then her passion for the arts gave her a legacy far greater than affairs of the heart or diplomatic treaties. Versailles under Louis XV risked becoming a stiff, ritual-laden court, but Pompadour breathed new life into it. Soft, refined, and saturated with art, she was not only a mistress or an advisor, but a great patron, shaping the very face of French culture in the 18th century. Pompadour loved beauty as if it were life itself. She was not content to merely collect. She created, directed, and promoted art with her own hands. Thanks to her, Rococo, with its lightness, grace, bright colors, and flowing lines, became the emblem of France. In the rooms she decorated and the paintings she commissioned, Rococo was more than a style. It was a declaration. Softness could disarm rigidity. Charm could triumph over austerity. Versailles, once famed for the grandeur of Louis XIV, was reborn under Pompadour's touch, transformed into a palace of elegance and femininity. She championed leading artists of her time, from François Boucher with his sensuous, colorful canvases to Jean-Marc Nattier, Jean-Baptiste Pigalle, and promising young sculptors searching for recognition. Her patronage went beyond painting and sculpture. She extended her protection to composers, writers, and Enlightenment philosophers. Voltaire, shunned by many at court, found in Pompadour an ally. Her salons echoed with conversations on philosophy, literature, and science, tying Versailles to the intellectual currents sweeping across Europe. Perhaps her greatest legacy was the founding and flourishing of the Sèvres porcelain manufactory. What began as a modest workshop, under her generous sponsorship, blossomed into Europe's finest producer of luxury porcelain. The teapots, vases, and figurines crafted at Sèvres graced Versailles and traveled abroad, becoming symbols of French sophistication. One could say Pompadour elevated porcelain from everyday utility to a living art form, one that projected both national prestige and cultural power. Her love for the arts also extended to books and printing. She owned an immense library, filled with both French and English volumes, and even maintained a private press to create exquisite editions for herself. Among those pages, she found solace, but also proved that Versailles was not only about theater and masquerades, it could be a seat of knowledge as well. What made Pompadour remarkable was that she did not merely purchase art, she lived it. Many Rococo works bear her personal taste and spirit. The paintings and sculptures did not only depict a powerful woman, but also captured a soul utterly devoted to beauty. She even posed for statues embodying friendship, tenderness, or loyalty, as if turning her own life into a symbol of art. Under her influence, Versailles became the undisputed artistic capital of Europe. Sèvres porcelain sparkled at banquets, Rococo paintings adorned the walls, plays and music filled the petit cabinet, all weaving together a Versailles that was no longer just ceremonial, but alive with color and creativity. If Louis XIV left behind a palace of grandeur and ritual, Pompadour painted it anew with music, elegance, and charm, making Versailles the very emblem of 18th century French art. Ironically, many of her enemies mocked her as a spendthrift, wasting the treasury on frivolous luxuries. Yet with time, those very luxuries became France's pride, a heritage that survived long after her death. In a world where women were remembered mostly for their looks or their children, Pompadour inscribed her name as one of the greatest patrons of the arts in European history. The final years of Madame de Pompadour's life were far from the dazzling brilliance of her first steps into Versailles, when her eyes shone with youth and a haunting prophecy clung to her name. Behind the glittering Rococo, behind the soirée where she once commanded every gaze, lay a string of personal tragedies that slowly consumed her strength and spirit. The heaviest blow came in 1754, when her only daughter, Alexandrine, died at just 10 years old. Jeanne-Antoinette had already endured 3 miscarriages, had already cradled children who never lived long enough to call her mother. Alexandrine was her last fragile hope. The child was not just the fruit of love, but a tender balm for the wounds of a cold and merciless court. When the news arrived, Pompadour rushed in despair. But it was too late. The death of her daughter severed the delicate thread that tied her to motherhood, leaving a hollow space nothing could ever fill. Not long after, her father too passed away, and Pompadour felt the very ground beneath her collapsing, as those dearest to her slipped away one by one. Her health, always delicate, soon gave way. Tuberculosis, that dark specter of the 18th century, began to devour her breath. Endless coughing fits, sleepless nights, the struggle for every inhalation, all chipped away at her vitality. Still, Pompadour tried to maintain her grace. She continued to attend meetings, to talk and laugh, to smile beneath her powders and paints. But beneath the carefully painted mask, her body was failing. Strangely, it was in these frailest days that Louis XIV drew closer than ever. He no longer saw her merely as a mistress, but as a presence woven into the very fabric of his life. He would come to her chambers, sit at her bedside, hold her hand, as if his presence alone might summon her back. For a king notorious for his detachment from family and his quick boredom with lovers, this patience and care revealed something rare, that Pompadour had etched herself deeper into his heart than any other woman. On April 15, 1764, at only 42 years old, Jeanne-Antoinette's life came to its quiet end. They say she greeted death with remarkable calm, just as she had faced every intrigue and every whisper of slander throughout her life, with a steady, unyielding smile. When her coffin was carried from Versailles under a gray rain, Louis XIV stood at the window, watching. Tears slipped down his face, and he uttered only a short, heavy phrase. "That is all the honor I can give her." A king who so rarely showed emotion now laid bare his helplessness before the death of the woman who had changed his life. Her funeral was modest, even plain, compared to what a figure of her influence might have deserved. No trumpets echoed through Paris. No vast procession of mourners filled the streets. Her body was laid to rest at the Couvent des Capucines, a convent that itself would later vanish. Versailles seemed to breathe a sigh of relief at the disappearance of its shadow queen. Yet in the heart of Louis XIV and in the memory of France, she remained a haunting presence. Pompadour's death closed the chapter of a short but incandescent life. She left before reaching middle age, yet lived a story most women of her century could never even dream of. From a girl of the modest Poisson family, she became the embodiment of soft power, a lover, confidante, political advisor, and great patroness of the arts. Her tragedy was not only the losses she endured, but also the solitude of her end, a woman who had given everything to the throne, but who, in return, was escorted into eternity by nothing more than a silent gaze and a few falling tears from a palace window. A legacy can be measured in victories, in lands conquered, or in monuments that withstand the passage of time. But the legacy of Madame de Pompadour resides elsewhere, less tangible, more delicate, and therefore far easier to forget unless one looks closely. She left behind no throne, no royal lineage, yet she bequeathed an invisible power, one that continued to haunt Versailles and France long after her death. First, Pompadour proved that a woman could step beyond the fate society had written for her. Born into the middle class, burdened with the ordinary name Poisson, she was never destined for the splendor of a royal court. Yet, with intelligence, grace, and unyielding will, she climbed to the highest station a woman without royal blood could ever attain, the mistress of all Versailles. This was not merely a personal triumph, but a reminder that power does not belong exclusively to those born into it. It can also be seized by those bold enough to reach for it. Second, Pompadour transformed love into politics, and politics into art. To Louis XV, she was not just a lover, but a refuge, turning cold ceremonial chambers into sanctuaries. To the court, she was not a fleeting beauty, but the hand that pulled unseen strings shaping the king's decisions. To the arts, she was not merely a patron, but the force that made Rococo a symbol, Sèvres porcelain a national pride, and Versailles the beating artistic heart of Europe. Third, she left behind a paradox. Pompadour was despised, mocked, blamed for France's humiliation in the 7 Years' War, accused of draining the treasury for her luxurious whims. Yet she was also the one who opened Versailles to Enlightenment thought, who defended Voltaire, who nurtured an artistic legacy that still inspires awe today. That paradox rendered her legacy both radiant and stained, both admirable and condemnable, and it is precisely this tension that makes her unforgettable. Finally, Pompadour embodied the cost of soft power. She had everything, yet she lost everything: her daughter, her health, the serenity of her final days. She was buried quietly, without music, without the grandeur of a royal procession, watched only by a king at his window, shedding silent tears as he whispered, "That is all the honor I can give her." That brief, cruel epitaph became the summation of her life, a life whose glory was bound to the throne and whose tragedies were born of it as well. Today, as one walks through the gilded halls of Versailles, her presence lingers in the Rococo flourishes, in the gleam of Sèvres porcelain, in the brushstrokes of Boucher's canvases. These objects still live, still breathe, still tell the story of a woman who defied fate and etched her name into history. And perhaps that is Madame de Pompadour's final triumph. She is gone, but her story refuses to die.